Alrighty, everyone, we will get started with this Literation Lounge. My name is Monica Groves from the Adult Literacy X Prize, and just giving you a little bit of information about the Literation Lounge. It's a monthly speaker series. You usually have 2 sessions a month. It's supported by our Barbara Bush Foundation Adult Literacy X Prize. The Literation Lounge usually features speakers and experts in the fields of ed tech, adult literacy, adult education, and entrepreneurs who are really working to break ground on new ways to solve the world's literacy problem. Our audience is pretty diverse with adult educators, administrators, ed tech, companies, venture capital, things of that nature. I would like to remind anyone who's getting on now to please mute yourself if you are not muted, and also be cognizant of what's going on in the background if you have your webcam up. So don't eat your sub sandwiches, Cokes. We all can see. And moving on, this is our last Literation Lounge in the series. We launched back in June. So it's been 6 months of having speakers come on and speak about their passion and their area of expertise in adult education, adult literacy, equity, and things of that nature. So to give you a little detail about today's Literation Lounge focus will be on equity in adult education. And our speaker will be Dr. Cherise Moore from the American Institute for Research, giving you a little bit of information about her and her expertise about what she's going to talk about today. She's really going to give you guys more information about the greater purpose of our work within the adult education sphere and how we're working to transform the lives of who are in need. Dr. Moore is a senior researcher at the American Institute for Research. She leads several national and state level projects related to adult learning, teacher training, career technical education, and workforce preparation and employability. Dr. Moore is Deputy Director of the State of Nevada Professional Development Project, where she leads customized, targeted technical assistance and training for each WIOA-funded agency in the state. And also there's providing research and evidence-based instructional strategies for instructors in technology and professional development. On CalPro here in California, she provides PD for WIOA-funded California adult education providers with a focus on administrator training, highlighted by developing and delivering an annual leadership institute. She holds a PhD in public administration and her MA in education administration and leadership from Arizona State University. She has also received an MA in urban planning and her BA in political science from the University of California, Los Angeles. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Moore to tell us more about our focus on equity and adult education.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Ms. Groves. I am excited to be here with you all this afternoon. I know my time is short, so I'm going to jump right in. Equity is one of my focus areas, one of my passions, and an area in which I am becoming more and more an expert in as it relates to adult education. So I hope what I share with you this afternoon will get you excited about your role as a leader of equity and identify some opportunities for you to continue to focus on strategies to ensure that students in adult ed have access to the education that they deserve. So this presentation, I'm pulling pieces of it from a presentation I've done in the past, and that presentation takes about an hour and a half. In our 20 minutes together, I'm going to try and hit some of the highlights. We're going to go over some of the objectives. We're going to define equity. We're going to talk a bit about the mission and purpose of adult ed, and then give you some strategies to think about as a leader for equity. You've seen the overview, and these are the objectives that relate and support to that. In the end, what I want you to have is a lens that focuses on making decisions and taking action that is based on understanding equity and the importance of equity in our work. So one of the pieces that I want to make sure that we talk about, and it's an important component when we're looking at equity, is thinking about who we are. And when I think about this Zoom room, I don't know who you all are and where you all are coming from, but to have a lens that looks at equity and focuses on equity, it's important for us to take a step back and look at who our students are versus who we are, who those we serve are versus who we are. What are the commonalities? What are the differences? What are the overlaps? What are the opportunities? And that can help us start to think about how important equity is when we are serving our students and making decisions based on that equity lens. So I'm going to give you a few questions, and these questions are just really to have you think about things that you do or have done that may or may not relate to our students' experiences. And as we move into that, right before we move into that, one of the things that I wanted to do to make sure that given our time together, if we don't get through everything, I want to make sure that you have all the resources. So I put that up early in the presentation so that you'll have access to it and you'll know where all of the background information that we are looking at today comes from. So with that, we're going to jump into these questions. Who are you? Some questions to think about, and you can ponder these. These are reflective questions I'd ask for you given our limited time to actually respond to, but take a look at these. Do you take vacations? What role do you have in adult education? Do you think that you have a background similar to your students? Do you understand what is meant when we talk about living in poverty or being economically disadvantaged? And then look on the right side and think about things that you have done. Have you ever attended adult school as a student so that you can relate to the experience that our students are going through? Have you ever experienced people making assumptions about you because of your appearance? Have you ever made assumptions about other people because of their appearances? And this list goes on and on with some questions that help you consider and think about the experiences of our students versus who we are as leaders in adult education and bringing opportunities to our students. It gives us time to pause and reflect on who we are, what we are, and who we serve, and why. So that brings me to the opportunity to think about defining equity and what equity in education means. What I would like to do, and I know that Monica is able to monitor and see the chats, but if you just have thoughts on how you define equity, I'm hoping at the end, if there's time, we can go back and see what some of your thoughts around equity and how you define it looks like and compares to how equity is defined. So I'll give you a moment as I transition into our next slide to think about and type into the chat pod and continue typing as we're talking. How do you define equity in education? So equity, when we think about what the dictionary says about equity, it says that equity is justice according to natural law or right, and it's specifically focused on freedom from bias or favoritism. And with that, we recognize that equity is different than equality. Equity is giving everyone what they need to be successful. Sometimes people confuse this with equality, and in adult education, that's an important distinction, because equality is where everyone gets treated the same. Everyone has the same opportunity, and we make the assumption that they're all starting from the same place. But we know with equity, that is not the case. And because of that, it can sometimes appear to be not fair, or it can appear to be leaning towards one perspective or one person's needs over the others. But what it really is doing is helping us to get closer to ensuring that all of our students, no matter where they come from, whatever their background might be, that they're all given the chance for success, because through equity, that's where you see leveling of the playing fields happening. I'm a visual learner, and so I'm going to share with you an image to me that helps define equity from equality. And you may have seen this already, but when you look at this, you get to think about equality. Everyone is on the same box, on the same crate. But when we look at equity, the person who needs more of a lift is given 2 crates to stand on, and the person who doesn't need the lift to see the field doesn't need the crate to stand on at all. This is a distinction between equity and equality. And it goes further when you think about what we really see in society often and in our classrooms often is that reality picture there, where in reality, those who might not need a lift at all often have access to multiple lifts and are given much more than maybe those who really need it are. And those who really need it, the young person on the far right, in fact, the opportunity and access is taken further away from him, and they're given less of an opportunity to succeed. I know we're going fast, but I'm hoping that this gives you an idea of where we're going with this webinar in the next 5 minutes or so that I have to talk about some of our highlights. So when you think about adult education, it's important to always go back to why we do what we do. What is our reason for existing? Why is it that we are choosing to work in this field where we know that those that we serve? When I was hired into this field 30 years ago and started my career here, I was told that our mission was to serve those most in need. And so with that understanding, it's really important to think about the why. Why do we exist? Our purpose, our mission has a lot to do with recognizing that students who don't have full access to the resources to success often are struggling to succeed, struggling to engage, struggling to have authentic learning experiences, struggling to create meaning out of their education. And this is from the cradle to grave education. We work in adult education, but it's important for us to think about we have to provide the supports that these students need when they don't have full access to it for their students' success. So there are several ways to look at equity, many ways to think about it. One of the most common is looking at it from a financial perspective, thinking about poverty and the poverty line established in our country. When we look at equity, many of our students in adult ed come from underemployed, unemployed, low income, the barrier list goes on, language learners, immigrants, new arrivals, newcomers, newly released citizens. But poverty is one of the ways in which you can look at equity and access. And so that's what I've chosen. It's not the only. Those other barriers are there, as I just shared, but it's one of them. And I've highlighted that number for families to succeed, $25,000 a year. That's a huge barrier, and one in which we need to understand as we're thinking about equity and providing support for our students. Some other stats to think about when we look at equity in our country related to poverty. It's important to know how many people live in poverty, and it's important to know that for us, those adults with no high school diploma and no college, they have a poverty rate of 24.5% with no high school diploma if they're 25 and over. This is important as we look at equity. Our overall purpose for those programs and those who are supporting programs and helping programs, it really is to improve the quality of life of our students. And we can't do that if we're not thinking about providing them services with the focus on equity, with the lens through equity. And that is really the mission and purpose of our work. And it's not easy, it's challenging work, but it's work that we have chosen to do, be it through our providing them access to educational resources and technologies to help them achieve faster. That is a lift towards equity and moving the barriers from their success. Whatever it might be, our challenge is there, but our mission is to meet that so that our students can be successful and improve their quality of life. So, how do we get there? Well, I'm going to move us into a few strategies in the next few minutes around enhancing equity. And as I shared earlier on, the resources I provided have the details of these because I'm going to be running through them in the next few minutes. But they're really 4 domains of equity strategies in education. Those domains of influence relate to curriculum, interpretation, instructional practices, assessment, and community involvement. And the two that are highlighted in the turquoise, the curriculum interpretation and instructional practices, are the ones that we're going to run through in the next few minutes. But all of those are critical. And again, the resources provided highlight all of them. And because of our time, I'm only going to hit on two and really might just get to one, but they're all in the resources. So when you think about curriculum, that's the part that's the what is in front of our students. That's a lot of the work that you're doing by providing them something in front of them to help them to learn. It's the content, it's the information, it's the curriculum. And for us as leaders of equity, it's important to make sure that the what is in front of them, the way that it is interpreted by the deliverers of the content and the receivers, it needs to be delivered in a way in which it really hits issues of diversity and shows that there is a value statement for understanding equity and the variety of differences from which all of our students come. And if we are leaders of equity, then we're going to be modeling what we're doing to support our team members and our colleagues, and also having that same approach to working with our students, thinking with that mindset when they're working with our adult education students. We're also going to be clarifying any misconceptions. If we hear about or think about, as you're putting tools together, as you're putting apps together, as you're putting curriculum and content together, if you hear someone say something that makes assumptions about students' capabilities and abilities to learn, you thinking through and with the lens of equity are going to clarify those misconceptions immediately. And you're going to make sure that there's a safe and affirming learning environment with whatever tools and resources we are providing those students that we serve. The next few slides have some details on how to do more in each of those areas. I'm looking at the time, Monica, and I'm noticing I have about a minute left. You will get these slides, and so you will see the details of each of these areas in which you can dig deeper for clarifying the misconceptions. For example, here's one of the ways in which you would have some highlights of how to do that, but you'll have these slides to use as a resource and tool. And I'm going to move us to then the next one, which is instructional practices, and the 4 pieces under that domain of influence that help us to really support and think with the mindset of equity. Here, we are really focusing on supporting students where their needs are. And so as you saw the picture in the beginning that showed the students on the crates, if we are thinking with the lens of equity, all of those who are in contact with our students are making sure that our students can access the entirety of the content, the entirety of the curriculum, that there aren't pieces that are limited because of who they are. And we are also recognizing where biases exist. And so in whatever materials that we are creating and putting in front of the students, we're making sure that we are supporting students where they're at. You see here an example around special education and whatever the other needs might be that our adult learners have. And again, with each of these, just like the other one, these are further details under each of those areas that help you, for example, recognizing the potential for bias. Setting high expectations is the way in which we combat that. And so I know that it is over the 20 minutes or so that we have. Quickly, we have gone through these domains of influence as it relates to adult education and focusing what we are providing our students through a lens of equity. We've looked at the 4 supporters under curriculum interpretation as well as under instructional practices. And as we wrap up, the things I want us to think about is what can we do as leaders for equity and providing leadership for equity? What can we do to make sure that we are staying motivated to really boldly stand up for those students that we serve? How can we ensure their success through a lens of equity? And we won't have a lot of time, but as we get to questions, hopefully you can share some comments and thoughts about that in terms of how you can stay motivated to really boldly stand up for the students that we serve. As we wrap up, I want us to think about equity in this last way in which it helps me to reframe our work. This says, and it's from Albert Einstein, that everybody is a genius, but if we judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid. And so when we think about equity, we want to make sure that we are giving those students the supports that they need to be successful, not putting them within the expectations that we have where we're just giving them all the same if we know that they need different supports to be successful. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Monica and ask if there are any questions, comments, and concerns. I know we ran through thinking about that quickly. You will get this PowerPoint, and then I also want to make sure that you are aware that you're going to get a summary handout that includes in it materials that summarize our approach to equity as we think about adult education and really charting the path to equity. And it will give you highlights and summary of what we share, but really it's helping you to think about how can we invite space for dialogues around equity, how are we defining equity, how do we analyze it and think through it in terms of all of the different demographic areas and barriers that our students have, and then how do we empower them to build capacity within what we do and for our students. So with that, Monica, I am open for questions, and thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, thank you. Everyone, you can feel free to type any questions you may have in regard to the presentation in the chat window. Also, if you're not in a position to type, maybe you're on the go, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question. I want to give you guys the opportunity to do that and recognize that everyone may not be stationary. They may be driving on the go or something like that. So you do feel free to unmute your mic and ask questions if you feel. And I'll start with one question. I know you talked about equity in programming. Can you give an example of equity in programming that was successful and maybe is replicable that could be used in other organizations?
Yes, so I was a director of a small program in Southern California, and we had a number of students who wanted to take our classes, but the times in which we offered those classes weren't as conducive to what they needed with childcare and other issues. And so striving to make sure that we provided the supports and access that our students needed, we found a way in which we could provide childcare on the site for free for our students so that they didn't have that barrier of not being able to come to class because they didn't have childcare available during the hours in which we had classes. So that's an example of programming changes that we made to accommodate our students' needs.
Thank you, thank you. And if we have any other questions, please feel free to unmute your mic and ask, or you can type in the chat window, whichever one you prefer. And in case you're wondering, the presentation as well as the resource guide will be shared with you guys within 24 hours of today's talk, and you'll receive an email with those two documents as well as this recorded video that you can share out to anyone within your organization or the community that you feel could use as a benefit.
And I see a colleague of mine who is on, and I want to make sure that I recognize him, Mr. Matthew Oberlander. Thank you so much for joining today. The handout that you saw earlier, he actually developed that based on a webinar that he put together from these materials about a week or so ago. So thank you for joining today, Matthew.
Thank you. Another question is, you spoke about bias in special education identification. Could you go a little bit more into detail on that bias and how it may unwittingly put someone in the special education program where they may not need to be?
Right. So oftentimes it's easy for people to make quick assumptions about, oh, this student has, and this is less so in adult ed, more so in secondary and elementary ed where you see this happening. But there are assumptions made that because a student might have some special learning needs, that they aren't able to get the supports that they need in a mainstream class. And so they quickly categorize them give them a title, and put them into the special ed programming services without first thinking, what can I do in my program and my curriculum and my delivery to change the access to provide the support for those students with special needs, the accommodations and the modifications that can support them in the mainstream class, instead of saying, oh, nope, we're going to move them over there. And you'll see that happening, unfortunately, more and more, where special ed programs are growing in numbers of students because there's a lack of pause about what can I do as an instructor and educator to provide the necessary modifications and accommodations to support them.
Thank you. And do you feel that, is there a proportionate or a significant number of adult students who are currently enrolled in adult education courses who were identified as special education, didn't get the basic foundational things they needed, and so now they are an adult with a family to provide for, and trying to overcome those hurdles, being labeled one thing as a youth, and now are still struggling with those beliefs and that belief in themselves and their ability as an adult, trying to better themselves and their family?
I think there's a combination of those who were identified and didn't get the supports, and so they are now in our programs, and there's a number who were not identified and should have been and never got the supports because they weren't identified. And that number, in my own programs, I've seen that be reflective of a significant number of students. And the challenge for adult ed programs is they often don't have the resources to provide the level of support needed. But if they can start to think about equity, and if we're getting more and more students who fit this category and this barrier, what is it that we need to change in our programming so that we can support those students better?
Thank you, thank you. And as we hit about 1 more minute before 1:30, I want to give the opportunity for any other questions that you may have. So feel free to type it in the chat box, or you can unmute your mic and ask it as well. So in the meantime, we'll all think about the Jeopardy theme song in our heads, waiting to see if there's any other questions. All righty, going once, going twice. Contact information for Dr. Moore.
All right, so if you need to reach me, if you have questions that come up later, please just email me. It's a real easy email. It's cmoore@air.org. And I'm happy to share with you more, to talk more specifically about your experiences and programs, and whatever we can to help support your work. I thank you so much for all that you do. Thanks.
And thank you, Dr. Moore. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing in equity, knowing that this is how we're going to really work to transform the lives of adults who are sometimes the hardest to reach, and in a way that kind of fits or meshes with what we're doing here at the Adult Literacy X Prize, in addition to the Adult Literacy X Prize competition. We have also launched the Communities Competition, which is all about impact and increasing access to adult literacy for those who don't have access. There may be issues socioeconomically where they don't have a car or childcare and they're not able to get to a place-based class. So we're looking to be able to have these adult literacy apps be another tool, another free tool that they can use until they get to a class, or in conjunction with what they're already doing in a blended learning model in the class that they're already taking. And so with that, I'll give you guys a little bit of information about our communities competition. So let me share this one slide.
I'm going to stop sharing.
No problem.
All right.
So just for information, the Communities Competition was launched back in June of this year as an impact initiative to increase access to adult literacy and education for those who are the hardest to reach. We've had apps developed for adults who are reading at about 3rd grade level, and starting next year, we will be distributing the winning apps of that adult literacy competition in the Communities Competition. So if you want to learn more about the Communities Competition, please do visit communities.xprize.org to learn more about how you can compete and support the current teams who are going to be competing for their share of $1 million by distributing these free adult literacy apps. The registration and submission deadline, if you or your organization are interested in competing, is December 21st. And we have our last informational webinar for the Communities Competition on Thursday. Within 24 hours of this session, you guys will receive an email with the recording of this session, the PowerPoint, as well as the resource guide, and there will be a link about the next community competition webinar. Let's see if we have any other questions here. I see a chat popped up. Give me just a second.
That was just me.
Oh, okay. And with that, I will unshare my screen and see if there's any other questions. If not, thank you guys so much for joining us. I appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us for this last session of the Literation Lounge series. I really appreciate your support. If there's anything, questions, you can always email us at adults.literacy@xprize.org. So thank you so much for your time, Dr. Moore. We appreciate you sharing your passion and your expertise when it comes to helping adult learners, especially those who are the hardest to make that extra lift to be successful and to be amazing. So thank you guys so much and have a great day. Bye-bye.